From 2014 to 2016, I co-led a Twitter community with Ellen Mahoney of Sea Change Mentoring called TCK Chat. As former third culture kids ourselves, we built a vibrant online community of adult TCKs from around the world to share their experiences of growing up across different borders and its impact on a range of issues. You may not know this, but one of the inspirations for the Black Expat was TCK Chat. As a founder and a moderator, I saw the conversations that were happening with the hashtag, and I saw the nuances as it related to race and nationality. In this episode, you'll meet two women who are very much part of that community, both who are Black, African, and TCKs. Stephanie Taderea, who was a moderator throughout most of its run, is an adult TCK from Zimbabwe. She spent her childhood in Malawi, France, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, as well as her native country, as her father worked in the oil and gas industry. Astrid Chitou, who is Senegalese, spent her childhood in multiple African nations as a result of her father's employment with the United Nations. And as you'll hear shortly, it was intentional on his part to keep his family's expat moves within the African continent. Both have had their lives shaped by international mobility they experienced as children, and we talk identity, privilege, class, international schools, and more. We often don't hear the experiences of Black TCKs, and even less from African ones, but you get a chance now. Welcome to the Chatter. Welcome. I am so excited for this episode because this is probably one of my favorite topics when we talk about moving in international life, and the fact that we're talking about third culture kids, and the fact that I got two of my favorite people from the TCK chat world who are here. And so I am so excited for this episode. Hey, Stephanie, how are you?
Hi, great to be here, Amanda. Thanks for having me.
Astrid, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, as good as you can be in 2020, I would say.
Oh my God.
How about you?
Look, y'all already know I'm in America, so I feel like y'all already know the answer to this question, but I'm holding it down. I'm waiting for 2021 to be honest, but
yeah.
So, all right, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to throw this question to Stephanie to have her kick it off. So Stephanie, where in the world are you located?
I am in Harare, which is in Zimbabwe.
How long have you been there?
I've been there for about 7 years now. So moved here following university and kind of the couple of years post-university working. And then I moved back home. Yeah.
And so I think we kind of need to back up and start with your story. So obviously you're a third culture kid. So can you tell the audience a little bit about your TCK experience?
Okay, so my dad was in oil and gas for the majority of his career. And because of that, he used to get moved around the world, basically. So I was almost born in Nigeria, but born in Zimbabwe, which is my passport country. Then we moved to Malawi in my very early childhood, came back to Zimbabwe. And then after that came kind of the more European years. So we were in France, then we came back, then we were in East Africa. We did Ethiopia and Eritrea. From there, I moved to the UK. That's where I did university and worked for a couple of years. And then I came back.
Oh, my goodness. And Astrid, where are you located?
So I'm based in Dakar, Senegal. That's also my passport country, but my DNA is kind of all over the place. My dad is from Benin, my mom is from Cameroon, and I have some Nigerian background coming from my dad as well. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
But I've been back in Senegal for about 8 years now.
And with your TCK experience, where did you go around the world?
So I was born in Cameroon, and then we moved to Niger, Ethiopia, Equatorial Guinea, 1 year in Senegal, and then we went to Eswatini, then Madagascar, and then I went to Italy for my university, spent 6 years there, and then decided, quote unquote, to come back, quote unquote, home 8 years ago.
Right. And so I think what I always found really exciting and really interesting about your experience is that most of your TCK experience was in Africa. Now, was that intentional on your father's part with his work, or how did that end up being the case?
Yeah, I think my dad used to work for the UN, but he decided very early on that he didn't want us to necessarily go and have that European experience too early into our childhood. He really wanted us to be as grounded as he could possibly make it into our African origins, which I'm not sure how that worked out really, but he tried. He really wanted us to be, to have a better sense of who we were before we would expand and be in Europe or other places. So that was a deliberate choice for my dad.
And that's, I don't think that's something we often think about. And I know, Stephanie, this would still apply to you with some of your moves, but often when we think about third culture kids, I don't think we often think about them moving within African countries. I think often we think about going, and we often don't think of them about being African. And I'm just curious, even with Astrid's experience, but your experience, Stephanie, what was that for you?
I definitely agree. People kind of assume if you're a third culture kid, and by extension, if you're an expat, which is a whole other kettle of fish, that you're coming from the Western world to other Western countries. They don't think about you as being African or Black. And really, a lot of people kind of make assumptions about you without really asking a lot of questions. So, for example, being in university, in a school that had a lot of third culture kids in it, but other people wouldn't assume you were a third culture kid. So people speak to you, for example, and my accent was very American, a lot less American now, but people would then just assume, oh, you're an American person. And then it's kind of like, no, I have a whole rich history and story, just like these other white kids that you kind of assume that they're exotic or, whatever it is.
So even just not even assuming that we fall into that category.
Exactly.
And if we do, because both of you have had really mobile childhoods, if we do, it's often, you moved to just one place, which is still a third culture experience, but not to the extent of 5, 6, 7 countries. What were you seeing, I think, Astrid? Now, you're a TCK within predominantly Black countries. And I think that's the part that's always been like my big flag. I was like, so how do you think your experiences were a little bit different, or how are they the same just moving within Africa?
Well, that's a whole, it's a loaded question, actually, I think.
Yeah.
The first thing that I think about is the fact that, even within my African peers, because I went to a lot of international schools, so there was a lot of people who looked like me and a lot of people who also didn't look like me, right? So there was a bit of that diversity kind of situation from the time I was 2, 3, 4 years old. So I've always been surrounded by that kind of thing. I think what was always most difficult for me when I was growing up was coming home and having to explain to some people who I was. It always sounded to people like I was showing off, where all I was just trying to explain was, this is just my story, right? So there's always this notion that when we think about, people who are moving, you don't think about people who look like us. But there's a lot of people who were just like me, who look just like me all around, and all the, in all the different places that I went to. But coming home was always hard because people just assumed that I was just saying things to boast, talk about where I grew up or where I was, and people just didn't understand that. But with regards to the assumptions that people make when you're outside of Africa, what Stephanie said is dead on. People always kind of assume that you're just African. Somehow it's just that's all there is there. And it's but I'm an African with a little bit of a twist, because actually, first, Africa is very diverse, and I have experienced all those different parts of Africa all around my childhood. So, it was always very difficult to have to explain to people who I was and what I was about without having to fall into one specific box, whether that was within, people who were at home or people who were outside of the continent that I had to encounter later on in university, for example.
How old were you during your first move that you remember?
like 3, maybe less than 3. Yeah.
3, about 3. Okay.
Yeah, less than 3 actually, because my parents moved to Niger when about 2 actually, because that's where they got married. Yeah, I was 2.
And then how long were you in Niger?
For 3 years.
Okay.
And then we moved to Ethiopia for 3 years. Yeah.
And then Stephanie, how old were you on your first move?
I was also about 2.
And where'd you go?
To Malawi.
And how long in Malawi?
Malawi was just about a year.
And so I'm curious, because both of you are younger than me, and I heard the term third culture kid probably in my later high school years, and that's when the term was really starting to blow up. When did you guys first understand or even hear that term TCK?
For me, it was in university. I think being in a school, once again, which had a lot of third culture kids in it, I was taking, I think it was a psychology course or something, and my professor was she was a third culture kid herself. So it was something that she loved to speak about, and then she kind of went into the psychology of that and, explained it a bit more.
Oh, okay. So for some reason, I thought it would have been earlier because I know both of you are products of international schools, so maybe I'm wrong.
No,
Go ahead.
It was so normal in school. We didn't have a name for it, of coming back to what Astrid was saying, where on one hand, yes, you can pinpoint all the ways that you were different, but in a lot of ways, there were other people just like you, and your story wasn't so extraordinary. So I don't really ever remember in school any teacher saying, okay, this is called third culture kid, and this is what it means. It was more as an older person kind of starting to unpack some of those things, especially because we had a lot more students that weren't third culture kids as well, that were being exposed to these strange people that they had never really mixed with before. Yeah.
I like that. We're so strange. But you make a fair point. To be honest, like I don't remember ever having a term for it up until about like university years. I want to say maybe like junior year of university. I came across a post from I think his name is Brian Boyer, like some Canadian TCK person who had like this group that was going on, and I was like, wait, there's a name for people like me. It just felt like I was like, oh my god, finally, like feeling like I wasn't completely dissociative, because what's really strange about the TCK experience, at least when you don't have a word for it or a sense of how big the community can be, you have the impression that after a while you've sort of like imagined your life experience somehow, because nobody else except for the people who were there can actually validate who you are and what you're about. And so every time you keep meeting people who are non-TCKs and you try to explain the complexity of being a TCK, you're met with such I don't know what the word is. Like, people just sort of like, what is this? And you don't have a word for this. And so I went through like a major like identity crisis towards like 18, 19, where I was just like, I don't understand, and I don't know how to make people understand who I am anymore, because I just don't get it. And when I finally got the terminology, I was like, where are my people? And that's kind of how I ended up on the TCK chat situation. You know what I mean?
I mean, I think you said something powerful, because I've gone through it where, especially when I was in college, and that's a prime time for it, or university, depending on what you call it, wherever you are in the world, where I just thought to myself, okay, I've just had this entire experience for most of my life, and then all these people have no idea what I'm talking about. And more importantly, most of these people don't necessarily care, right? Because they are living their lives. My life, I could have been recounting a movie for all they could have, you know what I mean, for what they could have cared for. And it is something. And I think both of you have touched on this, even in your earlier statements about what people assume who you are. And that's a conversation I've had when I came back to the States, because as someone who's Black, and we've got a pretty complicated racial history here, everything gets washed away and it starts with you're just Black. but the fact that you have all these other identities. And so I'm curious for both of you and whoever wants to take this question, especially, and I want to kind of split it in two. So let's talk about first navigating majority Black spaces, and then we'll talk about non-Black spaces. So as a TCK, you've lived in all these different places. But obviously, if you're in a Black country, for example, you physically present like the majority, but you're not.
Right.
How is that a challenge for you? I mean, especially in the countries where you are, most of these countries you are not from. How is that a challenge? Or what were the nuances to that experience?
I think for me, that's actually a tricky question, because being in Malawi as a 2-year-old is probably the last time I was among people that could be confused as being my people. If you go to Ethiopia, if you go to Eritrea, yes, they're Black, but they're a totally different ethnic group that look totally different, and they'll pick you out of the crowd instantly. So for the majority of my life, even on the African continent, because of where we were, it was a situation where I couldn't be confused for a local. It was very obvious that I wasn't local. And even if I was Black and they were Black, it came with its own biases and assumptions from the local people, because they have their own view of their ethnicity and their ethnic group, and you don't fall into that. So they'll be projecting a lot of ideas about Blackness and Africanness, which, Africans also consume and internalize, but it becomes an us and them kind of situation, even though they're also Black.
And I think
actually being in France or being in the UK, they might say, okay, she's French or she's English because they have Black people there. But I never got confused for an Ethiopian or an Eritrean.
And I think that part we need to totally unpack, because I think for folks who, I do talk to a number of Black expats who aren't coming from the African continent. Just the strength and the power of ethnic identity on the continent. Like if you've lived on the continent, you know this, is that you could have 50 Black people in a room, but they're all going, oh, you're this tribe, or these are your people. Like, they're like, you're not one of us. And it isn't even because you're like American. It's just, you're just not. You are not from the land.
That, continent wide, because, my sisters and I, we always joke that, is this because we are African or because we're TCKs, that you kind of get really good at unpacking what someone looks like they fall into, what category they look like they fall into. So you get very good at saying, oh, that person's probably from North Africa, or this person is definitely Southern African, or they're probably East African or West African. So within our own continent, we're very good at saying, okay, who's probably in a group and who isn't.
And I think that's a powerful statement, because I think people need to hear it isn't just if you're an American or a Canadian coming from somewhere else. I mean, we could do that to other Africans. Would that be fair?
Absolutely.
I learned early on that I couldn't fit in whatever in the local, whatever local mold it was. It became very apparent to me from very young that this was just, I was never really going to fall into any of these things. It didn't matter how hard I tried. You could learn the language, you could be friends and all that kind of stuff, but you just, and also because our identities are so mixed by the influence of the different places that we've been into, it becomes very, very obvious that no matter how much we try, we're not the same. Do you know what I mean? It's like we think differently, we consume different kind of content, we interact differently, we have different sets of beliefs. I also happen to come from a family that's also biconfessional. So my parents have two different faiths. My dad is Muslim, my mom's Christian, and that also created a whole lot of other kind of conversations that needed to, within the family and outside of the family about what does this mean? What is this child? You know what I mean? And so there was a lot of there was always going to be a lot of different identities that I was going to carry with me. And I understood very early on that I could play some parts, but I could never play all parts authentically, because I didn't have the full range of whatever culture my own cultural background was, and all the other influences that I got were also incomplete influences, if you will, because they were not mine 100%. There were things that I acquired because of my interactions. So yeah, like, so in Africa, we do get we do have that sense of, yeah, but you're not exactly like, you may call yourself Senegalese, but you're not
really,
exactly like me. Like let's not, you know what I mean? And for some time it's really heartbreaking because while you're building your own identity, which is mixed and it's for reasons that are not your own, you're trying really hard to figure out where you can actually anchor yourself. And to be honest, I've understood that there was no real place where I could truly anchor myself in terms of culture and identity. So I've learned that like people just have to accept that I'm a mix of all these incomplete but kind of beautiful pieces of puzzles that go together, or or just keep walking, because this is not happening. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's how it's been for me. Yeah.
Now, do either of you, because now I'm just talking about myself here, do either of you speak your ethnic or tribal languages of either parent?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yeah, so I speak Shona. Both of my parents are Shona, and I speak Shona.
Okay, so this is what I'm thinking. I'm thinking for you, Stephanie, probably what made it easier is that your parents were of the same, probably of the same ethnic, or there's a shared language that they both spoke that was outside of English.
Mm-hmm. It might have helped. I mean, my mom was definitely the one who was more passionate about making sure that we could still speak the language. I remember being 7 years old in Paris, and she's bringing up Shona textbooks that she brought on a suitcase.
Wow, that's awesome.
Being let's have lessons.
That's pretty badass.
But the thing is, I really feel that my language skills have mostly grown since moving back post-university.
Right.
So they were okay, before they were passable, but there's so many nuances to speaking a language. You have to be able to banter with people. You have to be able to like make conversation, small talk that doesn't have an aim. You have to know the local memes and the jokes that are going around and that kind of thing. So my dad, compared to my mom, my dad mostly spoke English. I think it was just force of habit because my mom didn't work for the majority of my growing up. Okay. But my dad was the one having to go out and navigate the corporate spaces. Gotcha. So, English to him was like, even to this date, I would consider my mom to be more of the champion of the language skills.
And the reason I bring that up, because Astrid, I wonder if you're in the same boat as me, is that, and I think you are, my parents were not of the same tribe. So they did not speak the same language to each other. So English was the language that was spoken home. And I think that if you have a family where the parents speak the same, because it's funny, I just did an interview with a couple, not with the wife part of the couple, but where they're Jamaican and they speak patois to each other, and they're in rural Japan, and the child's first language is Japanese, but she's picking up patois because the parents they are speaking it. You know what I mean? But I think that if the parents their language isn't the same, like their mother tongue, then unless one parent does what your mother did, which is still, I think, amazing, is really like make sure. And because the reason I bring this up is that I'm wondering if when any of y'all went home, if the issue came up with relatives.
Absolutely. The thing is, my mom tried. She tried really hard, but she wasn't showing off about my language skills to anybody. You know what I mean? And we had various levels because I'm one girl. I have 3 sisters, so there's 4 of us. And we have varying degrees of proficiency, going from totally fluent to like, I can understand, but I can't speak a word kind of thing. So it absolutely came up. And it was one of those things that added to the re-entry shock, because immediately the moment you land on home soil, people are expecting the bare minimum is for you to be able to converse in the local language. Right. So it's one of those very visible things. Yeah. Immediately, you can tell if someone speaks or doesn't speak. So already there's these expectations of like, no, but you are supposed to be one of us. Therefore, you're supposed to be speaking like this. So it becomes a point of friction immediately. And even when you try, this is the thing, coming back to the whole, you can never be enough. You can never play the part well enough. You can just be you. Because you can try your best, with the best of intentions, and someone will still say to you, you pronounced that word wrong. Nice try, but like you should have done this cultural thing and not that cultural thing. Good try. You tried. I see you tried. But actually, and it comes with a whole, the culture of the home and so many cultural practices that we pass on that are tied to language. If you say the wrong thing, you might even perform the wrong thing at the same time. So you totally go off on a whole other path.
To be fair, in my experience, it's been a bit different. So my parents were not intentional about teaching us any of their own languages because they came from two different countries, and therefore the only language they had in common was French. And then there was also the whole conversation, and my parents, I think, sort of went like, we're just going to walk on eggshells here because we've got the language thing, we've got the faith thing. So it was always like, you know what, we're just going to see what happens. You know what I'm saying? So we did the whole we learned French, the French is my mother tongue, and then we did English as we started moving around and stuff like that. And so my parents were never intentional about what they were going to teach us in terms of language skills and that kind of stuff. Because I think they were just really afraid of who was going to take over and what it was going to mean for the other side of the family, possibly. Do you know what I mean? Like, suddenly you're only learning one language and not the other, and suddenly you're only practicing one faith and not the other. So they were all like, we're just going to see what they want to do about that. You know what I mean? I really wish that there was a little bit more intent about this, because I think that my parents assumed that because we were growing up in Africa, we were going to have a lot of African values and African culture centered into us. But I think they probably didn't realize that there was also a little bit of active passing down that they also had to do, as opposed to just watching us grow in these different environments. So there was a lot of things where it's like you come home and then you're like, I think X, Y, and Z about certain things, and my parents are like, where'd you learn that from? It's like, well, my surroundings. And because they didn't enforce certain things, it got a little bit more difficult in that sense. For me, the reentry was not as difficult in terms of language as in like with my relatives. I have a very small family. My dad's side of the family is quite small in comparison to my mom's side of the family, where there's like 300,000 people.
Because we're Cameroonians, we're small but mighty. We reproduce.
So there's a lot more people on that side of the family. But here in Senegal, it's, only we can count, about like 10 major key players, if you will, and that's about it. And most of them speak French. So that issue was not necessarily a problem. But for me, I think what was mostly hard upon reentry is, again, being faced with the fact that I was so different from Senegalese people as a whole, and that I've always known that people wouldn't have difficulty accepting me. Even when I have to go and renew my passport, people are like, what's his last name? Oh, that's not Senegalese. How the hell did you get this passport? It's like, dude, of all the passports I could possibly, covet, this is not the one, but it's fine. You know what I mean? So there's a sense of not having been completely accepted also by Senegalese in general as a Senegalese person, and then me deciding that, you know what, that's fine. I am who I am, and that's fine. And so I guess there's a part of me that's also sort of decided that I didn't necessarily want to try too hard either to mingle anymore, because at the end of the day, it's like no matter how hard I try, I'm always going to be rejected. I've learned this from early on, and so now it's just like, this is who I am. Take that, leave it. It's cool. And we're just going to go with that. So my reentry was more difficult in that sense, that I had to affirm that I just wasn't going to try to submit anymore or try to conform anymore, because this was, this was a bit of a hostile environment for me.
Stephanie, you look like you had something you want to add to that?
I just really loved the point that Astrid made about that when it comes to parents, they had to be aware that you have to be active in passing down language skills, because I saw that growing up as well. Try as you might, if you have one lesson a month or every couple of weeks, for half an hour, it's not enough to make up for not living amongst a culture and amongst a language. So that's one frustration that maybe speaks more to parents of TCKs that I could see in my own life growing up, because, parents have this hope or this vision of what their kids are going to be. And a lot of time, language and culture are a big part of that. So it's one of those things where you kind of have to grow to accept that, okay, if I'm raising a child, in a totally different country, in a totally different culture, there's no way I can expect them to speak and act like someone who has never left this very specific location, So that's something that parents need to learn to release and to accept and to stop pressuring TCK kids, because they already fail people enough in a day.
Yeah. And to be fair, also, it's really funny because my parents always had this vision that I was going to come home. You know what I mean? They're like, you're going to come back. Of course you're going to come back. You're going to go and do your studies in Europe and all that kind of stuff, but you're going to come back. I didn't think I was going to come back, and I ended up coming back. But they always had this dream and aspiration that I was going to come back, but there was no active, there was no active passing down on their part, which is not their fault. I think that, again, they had no idea, I think, what it was going to mean to raise a TCK.
Yes.
Now that I'm a TCK, I'm like, I don't know. There's certain things because of my experience, I'm aware of, and I probably would do a little bit differently. But honestly, how the hell do you do this? I don't know. Do you know what I mean? There's a lot of things that just weren't in books. We didn't have the terminology ourselves until we were 18 or whatever. How could I possibly expect my parents to figure this out either? So to be fair, that's also part of the thing. And then also there's also this thing about also immigration in general, or being in other places, is you don't, sometimes you also want to be a person who is mingling with the locals, and so affirming just your own identity as such is also preventing you from actually immersing and having that experience with the locals, right? And so I think my parents also were trying to some extent to not necessarily keep us as outcasts. We're a Senegalese family moving to Ethiopia, but we're going to mingle with the locals, eat the food, that kind of stuff, and not necessarily assert that we're Senegalese, if that makes sense. I think my parents tried wherever we went to at least make sure that we were going to be interacting with the locals in that sense, embracing the food, embracing the music, and that kind of stuff. So I think there was that part of them that was sort of a weird juggling act that they had to do as well.
And so I want to ask this question of both of you. Did both of you, for your, what we would call in the US K-12, the rest of the world, primary, secondary education, did both of you attend strictly international schools?
No. For the time that I was in Zimbabwe, I was in a local school.
Okay, so in Zimbabwe, So what age range would that be for us?
So Zimbabwe was age 9 to 14.
Okay. So, but
some of the early years. And then, so that was 7 to 9 was in Paris. That was an international school. And then 9 to about 14, that was a local school in Zimbabwe. And then from then on, it was international schools. Yeah.
Okay. And Astrid, what was your story? Were you in international schools the whole?
Mostly. I think I've had a couple of passes, maybe when I did kindergarten and 6th grade, where I was in local schools. But other than that, they were mostly international schools.
And in terms of the communities that you guys lived in, were you, wherever you were you in, and I feel like I know the answer for maybe Africa, I don't know about for Europe, but were you mostly in expat communities where you were residentially living, or were you living just in the general community?
In Europe, it was in the general community.
That's what I figured.
University years, it was a bit international because, amongst other students and stuff like that. But also, I think in Africa, at least in my experience, the whole apartment block thing it's not really a fave. So for the most part, you are technically, you can say you're technically amongst local people, but you have a house, it's walled and gated, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I would say the same.
That's the thing. Yeah, because it's sort of hard to delineate, but it's because I know that when I was living, like when I was growing up, we were it was like where a lot of expats lived. I mean, it was in the city, but it was also the houses gated, all the stuff. And so I'm trying to get that marker. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break at this point, and then we're going to come back and we're going to pick up talking about navigating non-Black spaces.
All right, guys. So here's a conversation that I really wanted to pick up on because we, as most people probably have heard, or at least know at this point, we are all products of international schools. And I am very curious about your experiences at international schools. One of the conversations that we're seeing right now, which is, I would say, another outgrowth of the George Floyd protests and really looking at social justice, racial reconciliation, and racism across the planet, is what were your experiences as Black African TCKs as third culture kids? Because every international school has a history as to why they were created, and so they may or may not reflect the realities of some of us who went there. But I would love to hear your thoughts.
Where to begin?
I like that silence of, where am I going to go?
It's a lot to unpack. Okay, so for me, what really stands out is my experience as a 7 to 9-year-old living in France. So I think that international school, I think of all the international schools I went to, they were all very Western centric, first of all. So, I even joke that, if you want to talk to me about history, I know Germany's history. Okay, that's what I know. And that's literally because you talk about, Franz Ferdinand, going into World War I, going into the rise of Hitler, going into World War II, and then Cold War. And then that's like where it ends. So they were all very Western centric. But that particular school, I think they didn't do a good job of helping children to understand and navigate our differences. So we like to pretend that, kids don't notice anything. If we don't tell them anything, maybe they just won't notice. And then they somehow won't pick up prejudices along the way. But they still have biases. They still repeat the racist things you say at home, So it kind of leads me to a lot of intertwined things about Blackness, which, in this case is hair, is the specific anecdote that's coming up, which we love to pretend is not political for Black people, but it is. I remember going to school. I used to take the school bus with my sister. We had natural hair at the time, and my mom loved to put it in like 2 puffs, which kind of looked like, Mickey and Minnie, Mouse. For anyone who doesn't know who Mickey and Minnie are. So we went to school, you're very proud, very confident of how you look, etc. And the kids just started picking on us about the way our hair looked. You look like Mickey Mouse, this, that, and the other thing. And it was relentless to the point that we started begging my mom to relax our hair. And that led up to the first time that we ever relaxed our hair, because it just felt like this is such a visible difference, and it's such a bone of contention amongst my classmates. I'm the only Black kid in the class to begin with. It's a very visible point that, in your child's mind, this is what's leading to people not being able to accept me the way I am. It's because I'm actually supposed to be like this, but I'm like that. So all those elements, you're a dark-skinned person on top of it. You're not, a light-skinned person who happens to be catching racist, tones, etc. So being an African, with natural hair, with your dark skin, there was no point that I remember us having some kind of curriculum that says, these are where people in the world come from. These are the different ethnic groups. People can look like this or can look like that. We had International Day where you kind of wore your national dress and like ate some food from Japan or whatever. Right. But, they didn't really do enough to kind of nip some of those biases that form really early in the bud.
I think I think part of the reason is because when we talk about international schools, we also have to talk about social class. It's
Mm,
not every black kid who's going to end up in an international schools because these schools are flipping expensive,
yep.
right? So the reason nobody ever thinks about putting more history that's related to Africa and other things, or the history of other black and brown people is because, at the end of the day, this is not for us. In general, the public that attends these schools, the kids who attend these schools, are not supposed to be a majority black and brown people. If you are, you only get to those schools if your parents are working in private companies that can afford, that can have them afford to send you there. Otherwise, this is not, we were not the audience,
Mm,
unfortunately, for those schools to
mm.
begin with. So I second your point about the whole conversation about how much more. Sorry, there's an ambulance.
No, we can hear it. It's all good. It's all good. It's reality. But anyway, yeah.
This you won't be able to edit out, so I'm gonna wait until I make the point. Here we go.
No, you're good. You're good. Go ahead.
Okay, I was saying, the reason why that there's a reason why we don't hear about, we don't learn about all of our own history in those schools. It's because we were not the audience for it. And then at the end of the day, it's like, history is sort of always written by the winners, if you will. And if you're going
Yeah.
to a school that's meant to be an elitist type of school, or at least a school that's meant for a certain segment of the population, then, we fall at the bottom of the chain. So I second Stephanie's point about the fact that I happen to know a lot more about European and American history and politics than I know about my own country's, unfortunately, because of the way that, the school system was set up. But I also want to talk about, like, other sort of like more insidious ways in which you discover that you're very different. So for most of my childhood, I don't remember ever feeling like I was that different. I knew that, like, I was black, as in, like, I knew that being black was sort of some sort of a characteristic, not that there was a social structure to being black, right? And then I went to Madagascar, where everybody was sort of like, "Oh, no, you're black." You know what I'm saying? Because, like, in Madagascar, they have they have a sense of, like, saying that they're not Africans because they're off of on the island, and they really want to distance themselves from Africa as a whole, right? They also happen to have majority, like, straighter, silkier hair and that kind of stuff. So they really, I experienced very quickly that was like, "Oh, no, you're really not like us." And I was like, there was two families, I think, in the school who were black, and I was, surrounded by, other Europeans and other Southeast Asian people, students at the school. And then at one point during the school year while I was there was this other black family that showed up, and there was a guy who was about my age, and suddenly everybody was like, "Ooh, Astrid will finally be able to have a boyfriend." And it was the first time I was like, "Wait, what do you mean?" So it never occurred to me up until that point that I was only supposed to be dating people who look like me.
Yes.
Do you see what I'm saying, right?
That's
So
cute.
it's very, very insidious in this way that those kids would have already picked that sort of stuff up, and I wasn't necessarily as aware of the code. Apparently, that apparently I was limited to my choice was limited to that one single guy. I forget if he's actually a nice guy who happens to be black. Do you know what I mean, right? So there are a lot of initiatives, like, the International Day and that kind of stuff, where we're supposed to have these kumbaya moments and all that kind of stuff. But to be honest, like, there is no real place for black and brown students to really feel like they also have they can truly be seen in the system. You kind of are seen only because of your social class. You match because you can pay the dollars to get here, but other than that, you're basically, like, completely taken out of the whole curriculum and that kind of stuff. So it was a very particular experience for me, but towards the end of my childhood, not at the beginning. I'm thankful for that, because I think it would have been really, really difficult for me to, on top of all the other issues that I had about my own identity and the culture and not being 100% anything, how difficult it would have been to just have been so aware so soon about the construct of being black.
Let me ask you this question because, what both of you said was insanely powerful. You both left your international schools and you went to university in the West, right? Mm-hmm. Stephanie, you went to the UK. Astrid, you went to Italy. Is that correct?
Yes.
Correct. Okay. I think I already know the answer to this question, but I'm going to answer it anyway. Did you, whether through the school or the agencies that your parents worked for, so I know UN, oil and gas, private companies, whatever, or through your parents, did you receive any kind of formal or informal training or preparation for the fact that you are now transitioning to going to the West, with both of you coming from Black countries, even though you were in international schools there? Was there any kind of conversation, any just like heads up?
No, I barely knew how to apply. I barely knew how to apply to go. Never mind anything I literally had to have the principal look at my file and be like, why is there a chunk of information missing? Let's do something about it. And I was like, oh, do I need that?
To be honest, right? Okay. So like my parents had no idea how to navigate the system because this is not the system that they use in order to be able to go abroad, for my dad's case at least, because he went to study in Europe and in France and he came back. This is not the system that I was in. I went to an American school by the time I was in high school, right? My parents were just like, well, what is this, whatever. So they trusted that the I forgot the name of the
counselors, school counselors.
There you go.
Thank you.
Because the counselors would, thank you. Sorry about that. That counselors would be able to help me understand what was up. So my counselors did a good job at telling me, this is what you need to do. Here's where you need to apply. And here's all the process type of stuff. But nobody really had a conversation about, navigating white spaces. I suppose they assumed that I already had maybe a little bit of that experience, or maybe assumed that, just didn't think about it, period, right? Because it's not, and unless you are from a minority or marginalized group, you don't think about what it's like to operate in these really in these different spaces that are for you the norm, right? So nobody's ever come to me and said, oh yeah, and by the way, right, you are in Africa here. It's gonna be different, when you move. But to be fair though, I feel like I had a lot of insight already from the moment that it occurred to me that I was actually Black, even though I didn't quite understand what it really meant, right? Like I was like, okay, so it seems like there's something about being Black that I need to be paying attention to. You know what I mean? And so I understood that, there were certain ways that, I would have to either behave, code switch and that kind of stuff, but in order to be able to make people less uncomfortable. And so it was never really about, so there was never a guided conversation about how you navigate those spaces. You just realize very quickly by being around so many different people, and when you are in predominantly white spaces, that there are some things about you that you somehow need to tone down or just not mention. And so you just go about it that way, And funny story, when I went to Italy, I knew, Italy's not like the UK where, you expect to see a lot more Black people, or in France where you expect to see a lot more Black people. I knew when I went to Rome that I was going to see a lot of Black people, right? But I don't think it ever occurred to me by how much, right? And I navigated most of those years being, one of the very few people that I would come across or whatever. And it didn't really shock me per se, because I came in there prepared that I was going to be in a minority. But one of my aunts came to visit me, and she was at a workshop, and she came for a week. And, we went out and about for a couple of days and whatever. And at one point we're in the streets and I see her freaking out, going completely apeshit, because she just saw another Black person for the first time in 5 days. And she's like, oh my God, and then the other person was like, oh my God. And then it turned out they were you know what I mean? And they were just going completely crazy about the fact that they hadn't seen somebody that looked like them. But I, because I basically went there prepared that I wasn't going to see myself, type of thing. It didn't occur to me how little of these encounters I was going to have. Do you know what I'm saying? And so other people, other Black people had to kind of like, hello, girl, have you noticed that you're really kind of one of the only people out here? You know what I mean? Like, in order for me to realize how odd it had been for me to just kind of navigate in these sort of spaces.
That is, I mean, I've had that moment where I've been traveling around and it's only me, and then I mean, it's the international. Oh my god! I don't even know if you speak the same language. I've been in countries where I don't think me and the Black person speak the same language, have had the same experiences at all. And I'm like, oh my god, is it you? And then the funny part is, the people on the street are like, do they know each other? No, but this person right here. This is my person. Well, then, so here's the thought though, because this is becoming this conversation about it within international schools. How do you prepare students? Because you're right. I think international schools do a great job of getting you prepared on the academic side, right? Mm-hmm. If you are trying to go to university, I mean, that's another discussion in terms of if you're not trying to go to university. But if you're trying to go to university, because that's like one of their main missions, we got to get you to the best fit for your profile to whatever. But do you think that there is some responsibility, and it isn't even just for those who are in the minority, but maybe for everyone to say, you know what? These are some of the things you're going to need to think about, because let us be honest. Most of the international schools, and I've said this previously, when they prepare you, they're preparing you most likely to go to university in North America, Europe, Australia, Asia. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm saying maybe some parts of Southeast Asia, but probably more Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, North America.
I didn't even know Asia. I didn't even know that Asia was an option. And nobody ever presented that to me.
And I'm saying that I'm saying it now only because there are now more American style universities that have branch campuses.
That's good.
In Southeast Asia. But do you know what I mean? It's still very much a Western where you're being directed, right? I don't know if any of y'all, someone said, hey, you could go to university in Ghana. I don't think that came up. Like, okay. No. So that's why I am asking that question. Do you think there is some responsibility? Because if you're going to, for the most part, prepare students to go to Western style universities, there is a whole culture there that some of them,
but you'd have to be aware.
Right.
I like I said, I don't think that people have that. You have to kind of go into a 360 kind of mode in order to realize that actually what seems normal to you may not necessarily be a normal thing for other people. I don't even think most people understand how much code switching minorities have to do in general just to get by, whether it's like, the accent or, the lingo, like I don't think people understand that at all. And so in order for those sorts of things to happen, they would have to kind of go through some sort of like awareness training of their own. To be like, oh yeah, and by the way, it is true. Like we haven't been paying attention this whole time,
Yeah, and I think it kind of intersects with the issues of class, which Astrid kind of brought up previously. I think there's very much an expectation that, if your parents are expats, it means they made it, okay? If you're in international school, it means that you've been raised a certain way and you have become, quote unquote, civilized. You are a good Black, quote unquote. So know what's expected of you. Okay. You know how to conduct yourself. Okay. You know how to interface with white people. You know how to navigate white spaces. And of course, if you're then also downplaying the issues of race, that people face, then you're kind of like, well, it's enough for you to have the education and know how to use the jargon. It's enough for you to succeed. So already there's a problem if you're thinking that someone's class can help to transcend other issues such as race. So, yeah.
Where did most of your educators come from? In the international schools specifically?
North
Okay.
America, couple of Africans, but not that many. A lot of them were from North America or English.
Yeah,
Yeah,
mine were
England,
mostly.
quite a few. Yeah.
Mine were mostly also Americans, at least in the American style schools I went to, mostly Americans, and then like some locals, but usually the locals were doing like things like language, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily other other subjects. So or PE. So yeah,
Yeah.
I you
And
know.
and were any of them, so if they're coming from North America predominantly, were any of them non-white?
No.
Some of them for me were.
Okay.
Yeah. But mostly
And I was
white. Yeah.
mostly white.
Yeah.
So
No, mine
Astrid
were
is like,
almost 100%.
she's like 100% white.
Like what?
And you know what though? And let's go back to it though. You were TCK predominantly in Africa.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
that's my point, right? So at some point,
Right.
you get to a point where you've already been navigating the space for a minute.
Yeah.
I don't think people understand at that point that you need some further, warning
Right.
about what's about to jump at you, because what you have in that microcosm is amplified by a million once you get out.
I mean, I think it's just even, I think what's just even wilder is the fact that you were in international schools predominantly in Africa and you can't remember a Black educator. I think that says a lot about that says a lot about recruitment, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah.
I have this sort of, I think they need to do so much better. I think that there's something about people who still believe, and this is not just in the educational world, but it's also like, in any other, like, I don't know, the NGO world or whatever, this belief somehow that the non-Black expertise is much more valuable, worthy than the local Black expertise. And so there's always this belief like that they'll underpay the locals who then decide like, why would I want to work here when I could make a little bit more somewhere else? Or, just feeling like you're going to be completely disrespected in terms of, or undervalued for what you bring to the table. So I saw this in schools. I think that there's a lot of schools who still practice who still have some hiring practices that benefit non-white, non-Black people in general, or favor non-Black people, because there is this inherent belief that non-Black expertise is more valuable somehow, But then, like people like me go to school, we go abroad, we come back, and then at some point we're like, yeah, okay, so now that we've got this really expensive education that we had to pay for, how are you going to pay me? And then they look at you and they're like, oh, but you're local, so they undervalue your own education as well that you went abroad to get, right? And so at the end, they still had this very double standard situation about the value of the education itself that you gained. I'm going to speak about the NGO world because that's the one I operated in since I've been back from Italy, and it's just sort of like, I saw people who were interns who were making more money than people who were on a payroll, because the interns were non-Black and the ones who were on the payroll were Black.
So let's talk about this though, because I think I want to take it out to the greater expat space that both of you guys have lived in. Were there other Black families? Did you see a lot of other Black families in the roles that your parents did? What did that look like? Because obviously we've been talking about the microcosm that is the international school, but let's take it out. Like, was there as much diversity, whether it is being other African families, other Black families, other brown families, in the nature of the work that your families were doing? Like, what were you seeing in expat circles?
I think, especially in Europe, I would say that we saw more other African families. So those are the ones that kind of became our social circle on a family level in a way, because my dad would meet them through his work and then they would kind of become friends of the family. But I didn't really get the impression that there were many others. It was kind of like we have found each other. Now we are doing our African things kind of
Right.
thing. And when we were in East Africa, we really didn't know many other families at all, Black ones. Yeah, we really didn't. And I think it got worse as my dad rose kind of in his career. You could kind of feel the sense more and more that there were very few at the top, and it was a very precarious position even to be in. My dad would come home often talking about ways that he had to assert something about his blackness or his expertise, like Astrid spoke about before, because there were just certain ways in which people would just kind of see a Black man in the room and make certain assumptions about who this person is, what their value is, what their expertise is, and whether they have a right to be in the room.
Exactly.
So I kind of saw when we were in East Africa, it was not so many other Black families that we interfaced with, but I think I got the sense that people really respected that my dad was in a certain position. Whereas now, when he was kind of at the top and then having to be the boss for other white people who would even question why he's in the room, it was a whole other dynamic, even though there were more Black people around.
Wow. Wow. Astrid, what did you see?
When I was growing up, I think I saw like a variety of different families really that my parents interacted with, or at least my dad through his job. But there were a significant number of Black families that were involved in his job across the different parts of the continent that we were in. So I didn't necessarily have the impression that him being there was an oddity. Um, I think that but I also think my dad was very careful not to project that necessarily. And my dad didn't necessarily talk a lot about the issues that he may have faced in terms of racism or discrimination in his work either. I don't think it's because it didn't happen. I think he just didn't necessarily. I think he thought this was like kind of like to be expected and did nothing to complain about, so to speak, if you will.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I have the impression like Stephanie that like as time went on, maybe the number of Black families kind of reduced over time, but
Yeah.
but you, but in general they were still there.
So, I guess my question is, did you guys, because I was asked this question about community. So if you are, depending on where you are, if you're one of the few Black families that are there, did you find that your parents naturally gravitated towards those families as community, or were you able to get this kind of broad coalition of whoever was around, and it was related by work? Like what was sort of your support networks, if you would?
It was mostly those other Black families, or if we were going to church at the time, then they would kind of try to be social with those people. But I think the biggest thing that we got out of all those years was a stronger family unit amongst ourselves. So we had
Exactly.
our own rituals, we were our own support network, and you kind of knew that, come weekend, we're going to go do this place, we're going to do these activities kind of thing. So my parents didn't really emphasize that the social aspects needed to come from other people. We had each other and we could explore with each other, or you go do other activities where you meet people for the afternoon and then you leave and you go have dinner and go home, So they found ways kind of to be social, but I think they wanted us to be a close unit as well. So they didn't force anything, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think my parents were about the same. I think also because it gets tiring over time. Like I can see now why, at some point you're sort of like, does the outside world really matter? We're just going to focus on us because you just keep trying. You keep, you're like, oh, I have to go out here and introduce myself again. Oh my God, hell no, it's fine. We're just going to do our, do our own thing. So yeah, I think when I was much younger, like we definitely had a lot more like interactions with, for us, it was a broader coalition of people and stuff. But I think as time went on, I think my parents just got tired of having to renew, restart, all of that stuff. And they were like, no, it's just us now.
This is what we got.
And then, exactly. And so in a lot of ways, I think I've sort of carried that on for a while. You know what I mean? Because I understood very early on that I didn't necessarily need also the external support system in order to sort of thrive, if you will.
What was the most
break that though?
What was the most what was the most challenging part? And whoever wants to jump in, because I think there's some pieces of your answers previously, but what was the most challenging part about going to university in the West after leaving your international school?
I actually really loved university. So maybe that I should preface it with that. So I definitely saw, maybe because of the type of university that I went to, and because a lot of us were TCKs, so there was a kind of mindset that none of us are local here kind of thing, which I saw was different. My sister, one of my sisters, in fact, two of my sisters went to university in the UK, but to local universities, and it was a totally different experience with even less support. For us, it was a lot more geared towards, we want to travel, we want to go see more of the continent, that kind of thing. So I really struggle to come up with something that I think was really hard. But I would definitely say, when you're an African and you got that African passport, you're not living on the same terms as everybody else all the time.
Thank you.
That's all I can say. Passport is real. You can be a TCK and still be in the visa office every 3 months.
Thank you very much.
And, a lot of us, our stories, it's kind of who succeeded in getting the visas they wanted when they wanted them. You know what I mean? So for a lot of people, you'll find the why did you come back home story. It's very rare for it not to contain, to some degree, some kind of visa shenanigans in there.
And you know what? Yeah. You brought up something which, first of all, I think I just need to go ahead and copyright passport privilege is real, because everyone says that in every episode that I do that's not Western. But here's something that I think you just really brought up, and I wonder if you can answer this question. You're both TCKs, you grew up moving, you're highly mobile. All of a sudden now you are no longer under whatever travel documents that your family allowed you to move. How do you deal with that? Because now you're right, you have now ran up against the reality of most people, and that's access. Like, what happens?
Yeah. You shoot your shot, and sometimes it works. Go ahead, Astrid.
No, it's true. But to be honest, like actually, I've come to a point in my life now where I've decided that unless I'm going for something like an emergency or like to support a friend for wedding or birth or something like this, I am no longer doing this. I'm just not doing that. Like I'm no longer, if it's not work supporting my travel for a conference or whatever, well, COVID is now killing that. But if work is not supporting like some of these like visa applications or whatever, I'm just not gonna go. There's a lot of really important, nice places in the world that do not treat the African passport with that level of disrespect that like European countries or the US or Australia treat the African passport. So for me now, I'll go and put money for vacation time in places where where the visa is not that hard to get, but it's going to be a really nice place to go. That's been my sort of operating system since I came back, because I came back basically because there was all that whole pressure about having to justify why I was a good immigrant and I deserved to stay in Italy. And I looked at them and I thought, but what do I even have to be in this 10 meters squared whatever when I can get an apartment that I pay the same price and get a bigger place and feel like and not have this this sword above my head that tells me that, like, at any point, the life that I'm trying so hard to build is going to end. So I came home basically like leaving everything behind. I had a boyfriend there, and I was like, listen, I love you, but I gotta go.
Immigration, no. Immigration.
No, but there was also because I came home as an act of survival. I was also getting really depressed about the fact that I had to fight so hard to justify why I was there, and it was like, is this worth it for what? I've got parents who love me. We've got a nice house, whatever. We'll figure this out when I come home. Like, I'll figure this out. It took me a while, but I figured that out. You know what I mean? Like, and when I came back, I didn't actually think I was going to stay for this long, but I have, and I'm grateful also for the experience of being back and for the things that I was able to build by myself and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, that reality is a serious one. And to be honest, I'm only now mostly, like, at least for my own leisure time, I will only focus on places that respect me a little bit as an individual. And there's some really nice places in the world where you can go with an African passport, where you don't have to struggle and be disrespected all the time. I think at some point we also have to, put our money and tell them, actually, you know what, this is not it. For what? Like, I lived there, like, and I came home voluntarily. I don't need to go through this horrifying system all the time. My life is good here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And you're like, Etsy. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Nice. Yeah, I think I've kind of been pondering whether it's kind of having traveled a lot and having the TCK background that helps you to reach that point mentally. Because definitely, I think probably continent-wide, we still have an issue of associating the Western world with success and with prosperity and proximity to whiteness and all those things. So people do absolutely anything to go out there, even if you're an asylum seeker, legitimately or otherwise, or you're mopping floors, just to tell people you made it because you live in London. You know what I mean? So there's something about having those experiences and having enough good experiences as well to balance and say, you know what, I believe that it's not inherent to my existence as a Black person and as an African that I should take any kinds of treatments just to say I'm standing on Western soil right now. At some point you have to think, okay, on what terms am I willing to travel? Where am I willing to spend my money? What's worth it to me? What's not worth it to me? And and unfortunately, that's not actually a very common viewpoint by a lot of people.
Oh my gosh! First of all,
I didn't want that struggle. I didn't want that struggle anymore. Seriously, I was depressed. No. Like, because at some point you have to look at yourself and go, like, I really wanted to make my mark there, and I'm willing to build my life and all that kind of stuff. I spent 6 years there. As I worked there, I learned the language. I was dating, all that kind of stuff. Right? I was integrated, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's like what would we rather have? And it's true, like, you have to unlearn basically that whole notion about, you're only success if you're in Europe. I think where I am today in terms of my career couldn't have happened if I had stayed. Nobody was going to give me that space. Nobody was going to look at me and say, oh, what, you're at the time, like, oh, you're 26, you want to do this? No, nobody was going to pay attention to me. And so coming home sometimes also means, that you come back with much more a richer bag, and you come in and you say, look, I can come in and bring what I've learned and develop what ultimately is mine, even though like, at least for me, I'm never going to be 100% Senegalese, whatever, but this is mine. Nobody can kick me out of this space. This is here, and that's fine too.
Yeah. I love that you said act of survival. I thought that was like, that just jumped off in my brain. And Stephanie, what you're saying about almost like economic resistance, right? And the fact that, and the level of disrespect that you've got to figure it out at some point. What is important to you, and can you also make it happen, and maybe not in the space that we all aspire to? And I know as we see the news and we see the global current events, and we see so much happening in North America and so much happening in Europe, that maybe it starts to look like a revolutionary decision when you're like, you know what, maybe it's by circumstance that's got me on the continent now, but opportunity is here, and you know what, at least I'm not being harassed, and If you are being harassed, you can't put a price on that, though.
Yeah.
You can't put a price on that. And so I've got 3 short questions to wrap up our session. They are part of this lightning round. And I always say, answer what comes off the top of your head.
Okay.
So don't freak out. I always have to say, don't freak out. And then people freak out.
No, because what are we supposed to, what are we about to get? I don't know.
It's like, how bad are these questions? No. And so I'll do the first one with Stephanie, and then I'll have her answer, and then Astrid, I'll have you answer, and then I'll lead the second question with you, and then we'll go back and forth so we don't talk to each other. Okay, cool. Okay. So first question. A big challenge is never knowing where to place a TCK. What's one country that people always assume you're from, but you're really not?
Nigeria or Kenya. Even in Zimbabwe, people just think I'm weird. People will be like, what is she wearing? Why is that nose ring in her face? You're not local. So yeah, one of Nigeria or Kenya all the time. Yeah.
Okay. Astrid, what about you?
I'll say Nigeria, but it's not technically not true because I do have 25% Nigerian blood.
Is it because why do they think you're Nigerian? Is it just
well, actually, when I'm in Europe,
well, I guess that was both of you got that. Okay.
Yes.
Let me go with that. Let me go with Astrid. Okay, Astrid, go ahead. Why do they think you're Nigerian?
When I'm in Europe, people think I'm Senegalese, so that's not the issue at hand. But when I'm here, because I look like an alien somehow, I look like I should be here. Like I should come from here, but they're never quite sure, right? So then they're like, no, it must be Nigeria because everybody in Nigeria is a little bit extra, whatever that is, right? Like, so I take that or American.
And you speak English. And you speak English, so
it's or American. A lot of people have thought I was American, and I was like, no, no, hell no. Especially not
this is a completely side question, but I've been thinking of it. Have either of you been to the States?
No.
My brother has though.
Here's the part that kills me, though, is the fact that you've been to international schools with American curriculums. You know so much about the history, and neither of you have been to the U.S. That's that education, though. You can see how education could travel, and you've never even been near.
They will even give you the accent. Nothing is off limits. But
they won't give you the visa. I know that part's that's the part. That's the part. No, I did an interview, which airs before, a while ago, and she said, I tried to come to the U.S. 5 times. This is why I'm in Japan. 5 times. They said no.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, Astrid, second question. Besides your current location, and we're thinking about where you've lived previously, where would you live again?
That's a good question. Maybe Eswatini?
Formerly known as Swaziland, for those who aren't aware.
Yes. But maybe for the kicks, because I had such great memories of that time, my time there. And, I guess it's just to kind of like revisit that part of my childhood. Or maybe
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Stephanie?
Ethiopia is a notable mention, but I think it has to be London for me. You can't take the nostalgia out of the thing. And I think there's definitely a certain life stage that I experienced while I was in London. So it would be a cool place to revisit. Yeah.
London always shows up somewhere in the conversation. All right, last question. Stephanie, best thing about being a third culture kid?
Your empathy, I think. Your ability to just take someone as they are, know something about what they're going through a lot of the time. Even if it's not like on like, you can probably relate somehow, some way. I think it's just a really great lesson in just letting people be who they are and just enjoying the diversity of people.
Astrid?
I was going to say no boxes. You know what I mean? There are no boxes to contain people. And you get to, as Stephanie was saying, you get to really like experience who they are. You get to read people a lot easier too. You don't make mistakes about that. Almost never, because you understand very quickly, like, because you know when you're growing up, you have to like discover very very quickly who your people are going to be, and I don't mean like your people as Black people necessarily, but like who your friends are likely going to be, right? You get to evaluate that much quicker, and so yeah, the fact that people don't have boxes anymore is lovely, because then you get to experience like the full range of humanness, you know, for what it is, the good, the bad, the ugly, and all that kind of stuff as well, and you don't have to contain them.
That is such a lovely way to end this podcast, because it's nice and sweet. Thank you, ladies, both for coming on. I knew this conversation was going to be entertaining and informative and extra, and it was all of that. And I'm so glad that I know you two. Thank you for coming on to the Global Chatter.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And so you will be able to follow both of them if you're looking for them on Twitter. We've got their IDs or their information up in the show notes. But thank you for this episode of the Global Chatter. The Global Chatter from the Black Expat is hosted by me, Amanda Bates. It is executive produced by Justin Williams. You can find all episodes of the Global Chatter on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcast.